The courtroom buzzed with tension as the case of the year was about to begin. Spectators filled the wooden benches, murmuring in anticipation, some whispering about the defendant, others about the officer standing near the front. Officer Randall, a seasoned cop with years on the force, stood tall with an air of authority, his jaw set, his hands resting firmly on his belt. He had been here before, testifying in cases, ensuring that justice, at least his version of it, was served. But today was different. Today, something felt off, though he couldn't quite place it. The defendant, a young black man in his early 20s, sat at the defense table, his eyes darting between his attorney and the officer who had arrested him. His hands were clasped tightly together, his body rigid with nerves. He had maintained his innocence from the moment he was taken into custody, but Randall didn't buy it. To him, it was just another routine case. Another criminal off the streets. Another open and shut trial. The courtroom doors swung open, and the bailiff called, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Carter." Randall barely glanced up at first. Judges came and went, most of them predictable, set in their ways, and usually on his side. He expected an older man, perhaps someone he'd seen before. But when he finally looked up, his posture stiffened. A black woman in a flowing black robe walked confidently to the bench. Her presence alone commanded the room, her expression unreadable, yet sharp enough to make even the most seasoned attorneys sit up a little straighter. Judge Carter carried herself with quiet power, the kind that came from years of fighting to be heard, from knowing the weight of the decisions she made. Randall felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't expected this. As she took her seat, the murmurs in the courtroom died down. The silence that followed was thick, charged with an energy that no one could quite put into words. The judge adjusted her papers, scanned the room, and then her eyes landed on Randall. For a moment, they held each other's gaze. He expected the usual judicial detachment, but instead, there was something else. Recognition. A flicker of something he couldn't quite identify. And then just as quickly, it was gone. She cleared her throat and spoke, her voice even but firm. "We are here today to proceed with the case of the state versus Marcus Hill. Officer Randall, you were the arresting officer. We'll begin with your testimony." Randall took a deep breath and approached the witness stand. He'd done this 100 times before. But something about the way she looked at him made his hands sweat. He wiped them on his uniform before taking his oath. As the questioning began, his usual confidence faltered. The judge's eyes never left him, watching him in a way that made his skin prickle. She asked questions that cut deeper than usual, poking holes in his report, exposing inconsistencies in his version of the arrest. The defense attorney followed her lead, picking apart Randall's words. The officer shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Judges usually let him talk, let him control the narrative. But Judge Carter wasn't letting him off easy. It was almost as if she knew something he didn't want to be revealed. Then in the middle of his testimony, she leaned forward. "Officer Randall, do you recall every interaction you've had with the individuals you arrest?" He hesitated. "I arrest a lot of people, Your Honor." She nodded slowly, then glanced at a document in front of her. "And do you remember an incident on August 12th, 5 years ago?" His breath hitched, though he tried not to show it. His mind raced. August 12th. That date meant something, but he couldn't place it immediately. His pulse quickened. The judge tapped her pen against the desk, her face still unreadable. "Let me remind you, it was a routine stop. A young black woman pulled over for what you claimed was a broken taillight." The courtroom was dead silent. Randall felt the walls closing in. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had made hundreds of stops like that. But something about the way she said it, so deliberately, sent a chill through him. Judge Carter continued, her voice even but sharper now. "And during that stop, Officer Randall, do you remember what you did?" A lump formed in his throat. His palms were sweating now. The spectators leaned forward, sensing something was coming, something big. Randall shifted in his seat. I don't recall, Your Honor." The judge set down her pen and stared at him. "You should, because I do." The air in the courtroom was thick, almost suffocating. Randall could feel the eyes on him, the whispers starting to spread through the crowd. His heart pounded against his ribs. And then for the first time, he truly looked at her. Not just as a judge, not just as a black woman in a robe, but as someone he had seen. Randall's breathing turned shallow as his mind scrambled for an explanation. He kept staring at Judge Carter, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had made so many stops over the years, pulled over so many people, that they all blurred together. But now as he looked at her, a memory stirred, something distant, buried, and best left forgotten. His fingers twitched. He glanced around the room, feeling trapped under the weight of 100 eyes. The jury, the attorneys, the spectators, everyone was watching, waiting. Even the defendant, Marcus Hill, was staring at him, eyes sharp with curiosity, as if he too sensed something bigger was unfolding. Judge Carter folded her hands on the bench, her expression controlled. "You were a patrol officer back then, weren't you, Randall?" His mouth felt dry. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you worked the night shift in a district known for high traffic stops." He swallowed hard, nodding. "That's right." The judge let the silence stretch, letting the tension tighten like a noose. Randall resisted the urge to wipe his forehead, where sweat was beginning to form. "Let me help jog your memory," she continued, her voice calm but cutting. "A black woman was driving home late that night. She had just left work. She wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving, but you pulled her over anyway. Claimed she had a broken taillight." A chill crawled up Randall's spine. He shifted in his seat, his mind racing for a way out. "Do you remember what happened next?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He didn't know what to say. Did she expect him to admit something in front of everyone? The judge leaned back slightly. "No, then let me remind you." The courtroom was so silent, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Randall's stomach twisted. He could feel it now, the moment creeping back into his mind. A car stopped on a dark road. A woman gripping the steering wheel, her eyes wide with fear. His own voice, sharp and authoritative, demanding she step out of the vehicle. He clenched his jaw. No, this couldn't be the same woman. It just couldn't be. But then she spoke again. "I remember that night because I was that woman." Randall's entire body went cold. A stunned gasp rippled through the courtroom. Whispers shot through the crowd like wildfire. Someone let out a low whistle, and even the court clerk, who had been scribbling notes, stopped writing. Randall's fingers curled into fists. His heart pounded against his ribs so hard he thought it might burst. Judge Carter's eyes never left his. "I remember your face, Officer Randall. I remember how you looked at me like I didn't belong in that neighborhood. Like I was a problem that needed solving." Randall's throat tightened. "You didn't just pull me over," she continued. "You humiliated me. You made me step out of my car, in the dead of night on an empty road. You searched me like I was a criminal, hands on the hood, feet apart. You made sure I felt small." Randall's jaw locked. He could already feel the shift in the room. People weren't just watching him anymore. They were judging him, weighing his every move. The judge tapped her fingers against the bench, her expression unreadable. I told you that night that I was a law student, that I knew my rights. But you didn't care, did you?" Randall opened his mouth, but she cut him off. "You laughed," she said, her voice like ice. "You told me that people like me don't become judges, that the system wasn't made for us." Randall's face burned. He didn't remember saying that. Did he? He had made so many stops, so many arrests. Sometimes things were a blur. But the way she was looking at him now, the way she spoke with such certainty, made him sick to his stomach. "I remember standing there, shaking, wondering if I was going to make it home," she said, her voice lower now, but still sharp. "Because I knew, in that moment, that my life was in your hands. And you liked that. Didn't you?" Randall gritted his teeth. "That's not what happened." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it?" More murmurs filled the room. Randall felt trapped. He had spent years in this courtroom, always in control, always the one dictating how things went. But now the power dynamic had shifted, and he didn't know how to handle it. The judge sighed, almost as if she pitied him. "The funny thing about time, Officer Randall, is that it reveals who we really are." Randall felt the weight of the courtroom pressing in on him, the stares like invisible hands tightening around his throat. He wanted to look away from Judge Carter, to escape the intensity of her gaze, but he couldn't. He was trapped in this moment, in this room, and there was no way out. The past had caught up to him, and it had a name. It had a face. And now it had power. The judge's words still echoed in his mind. The memory, once buried under years of routine stops and countless arrests, was no longer distant. It was here. It was real. He could see it now, flashes of that night, her hands shaking as she stood outside her car, the way he had smirked when she tried to assert her rights. He had been cocky, sure of himself. A young officer with a badge and the authority to do whatever he wanted. And now that authority meant nothing. Across the courtroom, the defendant, Marcus Hill, sat forward in his chair, his eyes darting between Randall and the judge. It was clear that even he understood the significance of what was happening. He had been on trial a moment ago, but now, it seemed, the focus had shifted. Randall clenched his fists. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. He had walked in here ready to do what he always did: testify, present his case, and leave without a second thought. But now all of that had unraveled. His past wasn't staying buried. And worse, it was being unraveled by the very person he had once dismissed. The defense attorney cleared his throat, breaking the thick silence. "Your Honor, if I may." Judge Carter held up a hand, silencing him. Her eyes remained locked on Randall. "Officer Randall," she said, her voice steady, "do you still believe that people like me don't become judges?" Randall felt his stomach drop. The room was waiting, hanging on his next words. He could hear whispers, the shuffling of papers, even the way someone in the back cleared their throat. He had to say something. Anything. That was years ago. He finally managed, his voice strained. Judge Carter nodded slowly. "And do you regret it?" Randall hesitated. He knew what he was supposed to say. Of course, he should say yes. That he regretted it, that he had changed, that he was a different man now. But the truth was, he had never thought about that night again, until now. He had never considered what it had meant for her, how it had affected her. It had just been another stop for him, another routine moment in his career. I don't remember everything from that night," he admitted, his voice quieter. Judge Carter studied him, her expression unreadable. That's convenient. Randall swallowed. His mind raced for a way to regain control, to turn this moment back in his favor, but nothing came. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder, people leaning toward each other, speculating, murmuring. This was no longer just about Marcus Hill's case. This was bigger now. The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, stood up slowly. "Your Honor, I respectfully request that we redirect our focus to the case at hand. This," she gestured vaguely toward Randall, "seems to be a personal matter." Judge Carter turned her attention to the prosecutor. "Officer Randall's credibility is on trial just as much as this case is," she said plainly. "And if we are to take his word as truth, then we must understand the kind of man he is." Randall felt his jaw clench. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning. The prosecutor cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. "And how do you suggest we proceed?" Judge Carter looked back at Randall. "That depends on him." The room went silent again. Randall's pulse pounded in his ears. What did she want from him? An apology? A confession? He had never been in a situation like this before. He had always been the one in control, the one making others squirm. But now the balance had shifted, and he didn't know what to do. Marcus Hill leaned toward his attorney and whispered something, but his eyes stayed locked on Randall. There was something knowing in his gaze, something that made Randall's stomach twist. Judge Carter exhaled softly, then leaned forward. "Officer Randall, do you believe in justice?" Randall blinked. "Of course." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Then tell me, how do you define it?" Randall opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Justice. It had always been a simple word to him. Black and white. The law was the law, and his job was to enforce it. But now, under the weight of her stare, the word felt heavier. More complicated. He shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of how tight his uniform felt. Justice means making sure the law is followed. Judge Carter tilted her head slightly. "Is that what you did that night?" Randall didn't answer, because the truth, the real truth, was beginning to settle in. He had never thought about justice that night. He had thought about power, about control, about making sure that woman, her, knew who was in charge. And now the roles had reversed. The weight of the room pressed down on him. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the one holding the gavel. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, so heavy that even the slightest movement felt like it would shatter the moment. Randall could hear his own heartbeat, feel the sweat gathering at the back of his neck. Judge Carter's words hung between them, waiting for him to do something, anything. But what was there to say? Every instinct in his body told him to defend himself, to push back, to regain control. But the way she was looking at him, the way the entire room was looking at him, made it clear. This wasn't a moment he could just talk his way out of. He could see the shift happening. The jurors, the attorneys, even the spectators in the back, were no longer just watching a routine testimony. They were witnessing something deeper, something raw, something that wasn't supposed to happen in a courtroom like this. This was not about Marcus Hill's case anymore. It wasn't even about the past. It was about what kind of man he was, what kind of officer he had been, and what kind of justice he had truly served all these years. Judge Carter finally broke the silence, her voice steady but sharp. "So, Officer Randall, I'll ask you again. Do you believe in justice?" Randall shifted, clearing his throat. He couldn't afford to look weak, not now. "Yes," he said, but the word felt hollow. Judge Carter's gaze didn't waver. "Then why does it feel like you're afraid of it?" A few people in the courtroom murmured at that, but Randall barely heard them. His body tensed. "I'm not afraid," he said quickly. The judge leaned forward just slightly, her voice lowering. "Aren't you?" Randall clenched his jaw, his hands pressing into his knees. His mind was screaming at him to do something, to take control of this moment before it slipped further away from him. But he didn't know how. He had never been on this side of the conversation before. He had spent years being the one asking the questions, the one making others uncomfortable. But now the walls were closing in, and he couldn't find a way out. Marcus Hill, the man who was supposed to be the one on trial today, suddenly spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Randall's head snapped toward him. "What?" Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Being in the hot seat. Knowing your whole life could change based on what someone else decides." Randall wanted to argue, to shut him down, but the words stuck in his throat. Because Marcus was right. That was exactly how it felt. Judge Carter exhaled softly. "Officer Randall, let me paint a picture for you. Imagine you're driving home after a long day. You are tired. You're just trying to get home. And then you see those red and blue lights flashing behind you. Your heart races. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you don't know how this is going to go. Because you don't know if the person walking up to your car sees you as human." Randall's breath caught. The memory of that night was coming back in pieces now, sharper, more vivid. The way she had looked at him with fear, with desperation. And he had ignored it. No, worse. He had thrived on it. "I wonder," Judge Carter continued, her voice quiet but powerful, "how many times you've put someone in that position. How many times you've walked away without a second thought while the other person was left shaken, humiliated, terrified." Randall's hands curled into fists. He felt exposed, like every bad decision he had ever made was playing out in front of the world. A beat of silence passed, stretching unbearably long. Then the judge's voice cut through it like a knife. "What if you were the one on trial today?" Randall's breath hitched. For the first time in his life, he truly didn't have an answer. The room felt smaller, the air thinner. Randall tried to steady his breathing, but each inhale felt like a battle. He wasn't used to this, not being in control, not knowing what would happen next. Judge Carter's words had left him reeling, but before he could even attempt to respond, something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors creaked open, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. He moved with quiet authority, his sharp gaze scanning the room before settling on Randall. The sight of him sent a jolt of unease through Randall's body. He knew that face. Knew it well. Captain Briggs. Randall's boss. Briggs wasn't the kind of man to show up without a reason, and if he was here now, that meant something was wrong. Randall stiffened as Briggs approached the prosecution's table and leaned down to whisper something to the district attorney. The attorney's eyes widened slightly, then flickered toward Judge Carter. The judge noticed the exchange but remained composed. "Is there something you'd like to share, counselor?" The prosecutor hesitated, then nodded. "Your Honor, I've just been informed of new information regarding Officer Randall." She glanced at Briggs, who gave a curt nod. "I'd like to request a brief recess to review this matter." Randall's stomach twisted. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Briggs finally turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Step outside, Randall." It wasn't a request. Randall swallowed hard, his legs feeling heavy as he pushed himself up. The weight of the courtroom stairs followed him as he walked toward the doors. Judge Carter's gaze remained locked on him, steady, unwavering. He followed Briggs out into the hallway, the doors swinging shut behind them. The silence in the corridor was suffocating. "What is this about?" Randall asked, his voice low. Briggs studied him for a moment before pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around. A video began to play. Randall's blood ran cold. The footage was grainy but clear enough. It was from a body cam, his body cam. And it wasn't from years ago. It was recent. Too recent. Randall watched as his own voice filled the small space between them. "Get out of the car. Now." A man's voice, shaky. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong." "Did I stutter?" Randall's voice was harsher in the video than he remembered. The footage jumped forward. The man was now on the ground, his hands behind his head. Randall's boot pressed down on his shoulder. Briggs hit pause. The screen froze on Randall's face, caught in the glow of the flashing police lights. Randall's mouth was dry. "Where did you get that?" Briggs exhaled slowly. "It was flagged this morning. Someone leaked it to the press. By the time I got the call, it had already started spreading." His voice was edged with something that sounded dangerously close to disappointment. "It's bad, Randall. Real bad." Randall's mind was spinning. He hadn't even thought about that night. It had been routine, just another stop, just another suspect who needed to be put in his place. But seeing it like this, seeing himself like this, made his stomach turn. Briggs ran a hand down his face. "They're going to open an internal investigation." And with everything that just happened in that courtroom, he shook his head. "This isn't going away." Randall clenched his fists. But he had nothing to say. No defense, no excuse. Because what was there to say? The door behind them opened again, and Randall turned to see Judge Carter standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Briggs met his eyes, his voice flat. "You'll lose." Judge Carter studied him, and for a brief second, he thought he saw something in her expression. Pity, maybe. But it was gone before he could be sure. "You should head home, officer," she said. "You have a lot to think about." Randall felt a cold sweat creeping over him. This wasn't just a bad day. This was the beginning of something he might not come back from. He turned on his heel, pushing past Briggs and heading for the exit. Every step felt heavier, the hallway stretching longer than it should. He ignored the whispers from passing officers, the sideways glances from court employees who had likely already seen the video. Outside, the sun was blinding, but the air felt suffocating. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking more than he wanted to admit. As he climbed into his car, his phone buzzed. A message. Anonymous number. Asterisk asterisk, you thought no one was watching. But we've been watching asterisk asterisk. His breath caught. He stared at the screen, heart pounding. Then another message. Asterisk asterisk, this isn't over asterisk asterisk. Randall's fingers tightened around. Randall's fingers hovered over his phone screen, his mind racing. The weight of everything that had just happened, the courtroom, the suspension, the video, pressed against his chest. But this message was something different. It felt like a shadow stretching over him, something unseen but watching. He swallowed hard and turned the screen off, staring out the windshield. His own reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar. For years, he had moved through the world with certainty, knowing that his uniform and badge gave him an edge, a shield. But now, stripped of that security, he felt exposed. Vulnerable. It wasn't a feeling he knew how to handle. His first instinct was to call someone, Briggs, maybe, or a lawyer. But what would he even say? That someone had seen what he did. That someone knew. The whole world had seen it now. A sharp knock on the window made him flinch. His heart pounded as he turned to see Judge Carter standing outside his car, her arms crossed. He hesitated before rolling the window down. "You don't look so sure of yourself anymore," she said, her voice even. Randall clenched his jaw. "What do you want?" She studied him for a long moment, then shook her head. "I used to believe people like you never faced consequences. That you could do whatever you wanted and walk away untouched." She exhaled, shaking her head. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe the world is finally catching up to you." Randall let out a dry, bitter laugh. Yeah, and what happens now? You think I'm going to jail? That the department's going to let this go that far? He met her eyes, challenging. People like me don't go down that easy. Judge Carter didn't react the way he expected. She didn't get angry. She didn't argue. She just gave him a long, knowing look. You think this is about your department? She asked. You don't even see it, do you? Randall frowned. See what? She leaned in slightly, her voice quieter now. This isn't just about your badge. This is about who you are when no one's watching. She let the words sink in. And trust me, Randall, people are watching. With that, she straightened and stepped back from the car. You'll see soon enough. She turned and walked away, leaving him with nothing but the steady hum of traffic and the weight of her words. Randall sat there, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. For the first time in his life, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about what he had done in that courtroom. It wasn't about one mistake, one video. It was about all of it. Every decision, every moment, every time he thought no one would remember. And now they did. Over the next few days, everything unraveled faster than he could control. The video spread like wildfire, plastered across news stations and social media. Protests formed outside the police department, demanding action. The people he once worked alongside avoided him like a disease. Even his so-called friends in the force weren't returning his calls. Then came the official letter. Asterisk asterisk termination. Effective immediately asterisk asterisk. Randall read it over and over, his mind refusing to process it. The words blurred together, but the meaning was clear. He was no longer an officer. No badge. No power. No protection. The reality of it sank in slowly, like water filling a sinking ship. He turned on the TV, flipping through the channels, hoping, praying that something else had taken over the news cycle. But it hadn't. His name was everywhere. His face was everywhere. He was no longer just a cop. He was a story, a warning, and then the final blow. His phone buzzed with another message from the anonymous number. Asterisk asterisk, you were right about one thing. People like you don't go down easy, but you will go down asterisk asterisk. Randall stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. His hands felt cold. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what came next. Judge Carter sat in her office late that night, looking out over the city. She had spent years in the courtroom, watching cases unfold, seeing the same patterns play out again and again. But this felt different. It wasn't just about one cop losing his job. It was about a shift, a change in the way people were seeing things. She thought about Randall, about the way his confidence had cracked, the fear in his eyes when he realized that his actions had finally caught up to him. Would he learn from it? Would he change? She wasn't sure. Maybe he would just disappear, find a new life somewhere far away, where people didn't recognize him. Or maybe he'd fight, try to claw his way back to the power he once had. But one thing was certain. No one was untouchable anymore. And that, at least, was a step in the right direction.